Hello, sir. May I help you? Those 5 simple words, spoken with trembling hands in the language of silence, would change everything. In the gleaming marble lobby of Harrington Global Media, a shy girl named Claire was about to discover that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness create the loudest echoes. This heartwarming encounter would prove that the most inspirational moments happen when we least expect them. And the person who needed to witness it most was standing in the shadows, watching every gesture. 3-year-old Claire Bennett pressed herself against the lobby's far wall, clutching her intern badge like a shield. This shy girl had perfected the art of invisibility in this glass tower, where ambition echoed louder than empathy. For 3 months, she'd navigated the marketing department's ruthless energy, learning that quiet kindness was often mistaken for weakness, especially by colleagues like Sienna, whose sharp tongue cut down anyone she perceived as competition. The receptionist's frustrated voice pierced the morning calm. "Sir, I'm sorry, but I don't understand what you're trying to tell me." A distinguished man in his 30s stood before the marble desk, his hands moving in elegant, desperate gestures. His eyes held the patient sadness of someone accustomed to being misunderstood. Claire's heart clenched. She recognized that look, the same resigned disappointment she'd seen in her younger cousin Leo's eyes countless times. The same helpless frustration that had driven her to learn sign language at 14, sitting cross-legged on her bedroom floor with online videos until her fingers could speak what her voice couldn't always convey. "Love, understanding, you matter." Her hands tingled with the familiar urge to help, but doubt crept in like ice water. This wasn't her place. She was nobody, just an intern who brought coffee and made copies. Yet, watching this man's shoulders slump with each failed attempt at communication felt like watching Leo all over again, small and unheard in a world too busy to listen. Taking a breath that felt like stepping off a cliff, Claire moved forward, her hands lifted, fingers shaping words with fluid grace. "Hello, sir. May I help you?" The man's face transformed, lighting up like a sunrise, breaking through storm clouds. "Thank you," he signed back. "I thought no one here would understand me." The entire lobby fell silent, stunned by this unexpected display of compassion and competence. But Claire didn't see the figure who had just emerged from the executive elevator, didn't notice the piercing gaze of Jonathan Harrington, CEO of the very empire surrounding them, as he witnessed something he thought no longer existed in the corporate world. What hidden pain was this powerful man carrying? And how would Claire's simple act of kindness crack open wounds he'd spent years sealing shut? Claire's conversation with Daniel continued, her hands moving with increasing confidence as she learned he was an art entrepreneur seeking a partnership for a community accessibility project. But her moment of triumph was about to be shattered by the very forces she'd hoped to avoid. Well, came Sienna's sharp voice, cutting through the lobby like a blade. "Look who's decided to play translator. An intern like you showing off. Don't think a few hand gestures will get you noticed." Claire's face flushed crimson as heads turned their way. Sienna's public humiliation was a calculated strike designed to reduce Claire's moment of connection to mere attention-seeking behavior. "I was just helping," Claire began. But Sienna's cruel smile stopped her cold. "Helping? Or overstepping boundaries that exist for good reasons? We have professional interpreters for actual client communications. This isn't some charity case for you to practice on." Daniel's expression darkened as he read the hostile body language, even without hearing Sienna's words. Claire's hands trembled as she interpreted the exchange, softening Sienna's cruelty, even as her own confidence crumbled. From his vantage point near the elevators, Jonathan observed the dynamics with laser focus. He'd built his empire by reading people, by understanding the subtle power plays that determined who rose and who fell. What he saw now was achingly familiar talent being crushed by those who confused volume with value. The marketing manager approached, drawn by the commotion. "Claire, I need to speak with you about interfering in matters above your role. Client relations require proper protocols." Claire felt the familiar urge to disappear, to become small and invisible again. She nodded mutely, her brief moment of visibility already transforming into public shame. As the crowd began to disperse, she caught Mr. Parker's gentle gaze from his security post. The elderly guard had been watching the entire exchange with the wisdom of someone who'd spent decades observing human nature. Once an art teacher, before budget cuts, forced him into security work. He possessed an uncanny ability to see potential where others saw only problems. "Miss Claire," he called softly as she passed his desk, his voice carrying the warmth of 1,000 classroom encouragements. "Don't be afraid of doing what's right. That man saw you, and so did I." His words followed her to the elevator, where she rode in silence to the marketing floor. Certain her brief moment of courage had cost her more than she could afford. But what Claire didn't know was that Jonathan Harrington had made a decision that would change everything. "Send Claire Bennett to my office," he told his assistant, his voice carrying an authority that brooked no argument. Now, 20 minutes later, Claire sat across from the most powerful man in the building, her hands folded in her lap like a schoolchild awaiting punishment. Jonathan's office was a monument to success. Floor-to-ceiling windows, prestigious awards, and photographs of corporate victories. But it was strangely devoid of personal touches, as if the man who worked here had systematically removed every trace of humanity from his environment. "Why do you know sign language?" Jonathan asked without preamble, his steel-gray eyes studying her with uncomfortable intensity. Claire's voice barely rose above a whisper. "My cousin is deaf. I learned so I could talk to him." Jonathan leaned back, something flickering behind his controlled expression. The silence stretched between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed, heavy with unspoken understanding. "Tell me about him," Jonathan said, and Claire heard something unexpected in his voice. Not the corporate authority she'd braced for, but something softer, more vulnerable. "Leo is 16, she began, her voice growing stronger as love overcame fear. "He was born deaf, and for years our family struggled with communication. I started learning sign language when I was 14 because I couldn't bear watching him feel left out of conversations isolated in his own home." Jonathan's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his posture, a barely perceptible softening that suggested her words had found their mark. This shy girl had no idea that her simple story was touching something deep within the hardened executive. "Your dedication to your cousin is remarkable," Jonathan said finally. "That kind of commitment to family speaks to character." Claire sensed there was more beneath his words, layers of meaning she couldn't quite grasp. But she also felt something unexpected. This conversation wasn't the reprimand she'd feared. Instead, it felt like an assessment, as if Jonathan was measuring something in her that went beyond job performance. "From now on," Jonathan continued, his voice carrying new weight, "I'll be observing your work more closely. Not as punishment, but as evaluation." Claire left that meeting with her head spinning, unsure whether she'd been warned or encouraged. But she did notice something changing in the days that followed. Jonathan would appear at marketing meetings, his presence commanding attention, while his gaze often found her studying her interactions, her problem-solving, her natural empathy. Meanwhile, Sienna's jealousy was growing into something dangerous. She began spreading whispers about favoritism, about unqualified interns getting special treatment. Her schemes to edge Claire out of projects became increasingly bold, as if she sensed that time was running out to eliminate this unexpected threat to her own ambitions. How could Claire have known that her greatest test was still coming, and that failure would threaten not just her job, but her faith in the very kindness that defined her? The test came sooner than anyone expected. 3 days later, during the most important presentation of the quarter, disaster struck in the most public way possible. Daniel had returned for a formal meeting with the marketing team, and the professional interpreter was caught in traffic, running dangerously late. "We can't postpone," Jonathan announced, his voice carrying the weight of corporate deadlines and million-dollar decisions. The marketing team will need to handle communications until our interpreter arrives. Sienna seized her moment like a predator sensing weakness. Claire? She's just an intern. She'll ruin it. This is too important for amateur hour. But Jonathan's gaze found Claire across the conference room. Claire, you're up. The words hit her like lightning. Every eye in the room turned toward her, measuring, judging, waiting for her to fail. Claire's legs felt like water as she stood, her hands already beginning to tremble with the weight of expectation. Daniel smiled encouragingly, but Claire could barely see him through the fog of her own panic. This wasn't a quiet conversation in a lobby. This was a formal presentation with department heads, profit margins, and her entire future hanging in the balance. She began to sign, but her nerves overwhelmed her immediately. Her hands shook, making her usually fluid gestures awkward and uncertain. She stumbled over technical terms, mixed up simple phrases, and watched in horror as confusion flickered across Daniel's face. Muffled laughter rippled through the room. Someone whispered, "I told you so." Sienna's smirk was visible in Claire's peripheral vision, a silent victory dance that said everything about how this moment would be remembered. "I'm sorry," Claire whispered, her voice cracking. "I need a moment." "Oh." She fled to the women's restroom, tears streaming down her face as the familiar walls of her old sanctuary welcomed her back. This was where she belonged, hidden, small, and invisible. How had she ever thought she could be anything more? The door opened softly and familiar footsteps approached. Mr. Parker's gentle voice called through the stall door. "Miss Claire, I brought you something." She opened the door to find the elderly security guard holding a clean handkerchief, his weathered face full of grandfatherly concern. "No one gets it right the first time," he said, his voice carrying the wisdom of decades spent encouraging young people through their darkest moments. "The person who truly saw you today was you. You saw someone who needed help, and you stepped forward. That's not failure, that's courage." His words wrapped around her like armor. But Claire wasn't sure she had the strength to try again. What if I'm not good enough? What if Sienna's right, and I'm just fooling myself? Mr. Parker's eyes twinkled with the kind of knowledge that comes from watching countless students discover their own potential. "Miss Claire, I taught art for 37 years. You know what I learned? The students who worried most about being good enough were always the ones who cared the most. And caring, that's where real talent begins." What happened next was nothing short of inspirational. When Claire returned to the conference room, the professional interpreter had arrived and taken over. But something remarkable occurred that no one had anticipated. Daniel was watching her with intense interest. Jonathan was taking notes with unusual focus. And even Sienna seemed uncertain about her earlier triumph. The energy in the room had shifted completely. "Claire," Daniel signed, his hands moving with deliberate clarity as the professional interpreter translated. "I'd like to request you specifically for tomorrow's private meeting. Just us." The room went silent. In 20 years of business, Daniel had never made such a specific personnel request. The professional interpreter looked stunned. Sienna's face went pale. "Are you certain?" Jonathan asked, his voice carefully neutral. Daniel's response was immediate and unwavering. "I've worked with many interpreters. Most translate words perfectly. But Claire translates something more important. She translates intention and emotion. That's what this project needs." Claire felt the ground shift beneath her feet. This man, this successful entrepreneur whose opinion carried weight, was choosing her not despite her vulnerability, but because of the humanity she brought to every interaction. Jonathan's expression revealed nothing, but those who knew him well might have noticed the slight tightening around his eyes that suggested he was processing something significant. "Tomorrow, then," he said finally. "Claire, my office first. We need to discuss your expanded responsibilities." As the meeting concluded, Claire realized something profound had happened. Her failure hadn't ended her story. It had somehow become the very thing that proved her worth. The heartwarming truth was that authenticity mattered more than perfection. But she also sensed that Jonathan's interest in her went deeper than professional competence and that tomorrow's conversation would reveal truths that would change everything she thought she knew about her place in this corporate world. What secrets was Jonathan hiding? And how would tomorrow's private meeting with Daniel transform not just Claire's career, but her understanding of what it truly means to be seen and valued? The next morning, Claire found herself in Jonathan's office before sunrise. Her hands were steady despite the magnitude of what lay ahead. Something had shifted overnight. The crushing anxiety had transformed into quiet determination, as if Mr. Biag's Parker's words had worked some kind of magic on her wounded confidence. "There's something you need to understand about yesterday," Jonathan began, his voice carrying a weight that suggested this conversation would venture into territories far beyond corporate protocols. "Daniel's request wasn't random. He's been evaluating this company for months, deciding whether we're worthy of partnership." Claire's eyes widened. "Evaluating us?" Yesterday's presentation wasn't just about the project. It was a character assessment. Jonathan continued, his expression growing more serious. "Everyone in that room saw a young woman struggling and chose to judge rather than support. Everyone except you, who chose vulnerability over self-protection." He stood and moved to the windows, his silhouette backlit by the golden morning light. "Daniel told me something after you left yesterday. He said watching you fail so publicly, then return with such grace, reminded him why he wanted to work with us in the first place. He believes authentic humanity is rarer than technical perfection." Claire felt pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. "So when he requested me, he was making a statement about values over credentials." "Exactly," Jonathan finished. "But there's more." He turned back to her, and for the first time since she'd known him, his corporate mask began to slip. "Your situation reminds me of something I experienced years ago, a corporate betrayal that nearly destroyed my faith in human decency." This was the first glimpse Claire had gotten into Jonathan's past, the first crack in his perfectly controlled facade. She sensed there were deeper wounds here, scars that explained his legendary coldness. The private meeting with Daniel later that morning was unlike anything Claire had experienced. In the quiet of Jonathan's smaller conference room, with just the three of them, and natural light streaming through tall windows, something magical happened. Claire interpreted with growing confidence. But more than that, she began to see patterns in Daniel's communication style, to anticipate his needs, to add subtle emotional context that transformed mere translation into genuine connection. "Never be afraid when you already have the language of the heart," Daniel signed, his hands moving with the poetry that comes from someone who has spent a lifetime communicating beyond words. As Claire voiced his message, she felt Jonathan's intense gaze on her, studying not just her interpretation, but something deeper: the way she carried herself, the unconscious grace of her movements, the automatic compassion that informed every gesture. Daniel continued, his signs deliberate and clear. "I need to tell you something important. This meeting, this project, it's bigger than you realize. What we're planning isn't just about accessibility. It's about creating a model that other companies will follow." Claire's hands moved smoothly, but her mind was racing. The implications were staggering, not just for her career, but for countless people like Leo, who had spent their lives navigating a world designed without them in mind. "But models require leaders," Daniel added, his tone shifting, eyes steady. "People who don't just talk about inclusion as an idea but live it. People changed by the act of caring for others." Jonathan leaned forward, curiosity flashing in his gaze. "What exactly are you proposing, Daniel?" Daniel's answer landed like a thunderclap in the quiet room. "I'm proposing that Claire lead the entire communications initiative, not as an assistant, not as a junior, but as director of a new department within Harrington Global Media." Claire's hands froze mid-translation. "Director?" Her, the shy girl who had been making copies only weeks ago. "That's impossible," she whispered. "I don't have the experience, the credentials." You have something better, Daniel interrupted gently. Authenticity. You've lived with the barriers we're trying to solve. You know what inclusion feels like from the inside. For a long moment, Jonathan said nothing, his expression unreadable. When he finally spoke, every word was deliberate. Daniel's right. Technical skills can be taught. But instinctive empathy, the kind you showed in our lobby that can't be trained, it's either real or it isn't. Tears threatened to break free as Claire absorbed the weight of it all. It felt like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. Everything she had ever dreamed of was being offered to her by two men who saw potential where she had only seen limits. But what about Sienna? The other interns will say I don't deserve this. Let them, Jonathan replied, his voice firm yet warm. Excellence always provokes criticism from mediocrity. The question isn't whether you deserve this. It's whether you're brave enough to accept it. His words struck her like a revelation. This wasn't about proving herself to critics. It was about stepping into who she was meant to become. As they rose to leave, Daniel leaned toward her with one final message. Trust the language of your heart. It hasn't failed you yet. Claire walked out of that room no longer the invisible intern who had walked in. She felt transformed. Yet in the same breath, she sensed the triumph wouldn't last. Neither she nor Jonathan could have foreseen what came next, how their breakthrough would be tested in the harshest, most public way possible. Sienna's jealousy had been festering, and it was about to erupt. The contract signing ceremony was meant to be a celebration. Instead, the air was thick with tension. Word of Claire's promotion had spread like wildfire. The conference room buzzed with whispers and sideways glances. At the back, Sienna waited with a smile sharp as glass. She had gathered allies, planted doubt, and built her case. That favoritism, not merit, had put Claire here. When the formal presentations began, Claire stood at the front beside Jonathan and Daniel, interpreting with steady hands, each gesture carving meaning into the air. She had found her rhythm. Her confidence no longer built on approval, but on purpose. But just as Daniel began his closing remarks, Sienna's voice sliced through the room like a blade. I'm sorry, she said, standing with calculated precision, but we need to address the elephant in the room. Claire's just faking it. She's nothing but lucky, and we're about to sign a multi-million-dollar contract based on amateur theatrics. The room fell silent. Claire felt the old urge to shrink, to disappear. But something had shifted inside her. Instead of crumbling, she straightened, her hands steady as they moved, interpreting Sienna's words for Daniel without missing a beat. Daniel's reply was immediate and devastating. He rose to his full height, his presence filling the space with the weight of authority. Through Claire's clear, unwavering interpretation, his words rang like a bell. This company doesn't need perfection. It needs people who listen with their hearts. I've worked with dozens of professional interpreters. Most treat communication like a machine. Words in, words out, nothing more. But Claire doesn't just interpret language, she interprets humanity. When I speak of barriers, she carries not just my words, but my frustration, my hope, my determination to change things. That's not luck, that's a gift you can't fake. Applause erupted. Then Jonathan stood, his authority thundering over the room. Claire will lead communications for this initiative, he declared, his voice final. Anyone who questions that decision questions my judgment and Daniel's wisdom. He turned to Sienna, his gaze cold as ice. As for unprofessional behavior during client presentations, that will be addressed through HR. Sienna's face drained of color. Her allies quickly looked away, her whispered support vanishing like mist at sunrise. Her carefully planned strike had backfired in front of everyone. But what happened next shifted the room even more. As the crowd dispersed, Jonathan approached Claire. His expression was softer than she had ever seen. You remind me of my daughter, he said quietly, his voice heavy with old grief and fragile hope. She once signed to me, Dad, trust me. But I didn't. I was too busy, too important, too focused on everything except what mattered. Claire's eyes blurred with tears. But today, I trust you. Jonathan continued, his words carrying the weight of a vow. Not because you're perfect, but because you know that communication is about connection, not just information. From deep within, Claire found her answer. I'm not trying to be a hero. I just don't want anyone left behind. They shared a moment of stillness, two people, united by the truth that real strength comes not from power, but from choosing to remain open-hearted in a world that rewards the opposite. As the room emptied, Daniel joined them, his hands moving with effortless grace. What you've built here isn't just a partnership. It's proof that kindness and competence can coexist. That inclusion makes us all stronger. The moment felt like the summit of everything Claire had worked for. Yet she sensed it was only the beginning of something much larger. 1 month later, Claire stood in the gleaming headquarters of Harrington Global Media. But everything had changed. The Accessibility Initiative had grown from a single project into a company-wide movement. Her new department now led innovations that caught the attention of businesses across the nation. The shy girl who once pressed herself against lobby walls now commanded respect in boardrooms, not through force or manipulation, but through the quiet authority of authentic expertise. Her office, her own office, with her name on the door, overlooked the same lobby where her journey had begun. From his security desk, Mr. Parker often watched Claire move through the morning crowds. She was no longer invisible. She radiated the confidence of someone who knew her work mattered. He smiled to himself and whispered words meant for no one, but somehow heard by everyone who needed them. Finally, she's seen. The transformation didn't stop with Claire. Jonathan had begun weaving accessibility into every corner of the company's operations, driven by a new sense of purpose, one that honored both his daughter's memory and his hard-earned wisdom about the costs of emotional isolation. The once cold corporate machine had developed a heart, beating with rhythms of inclusion and understanding. Even Sienna's departure to another firm opened space for change. The marketing department slowly shifted into a culture where collaboration replaced competition, where differences became strengths, and where Claire's inclusive approach to communication became the gold standard. But the true magic lived in smaller moments. Leo visited twice, his pride unmistakable as he watched his cousin lead meetings where sign language flowed naturally among many languages spoken with equal respect. Their parents, once skeptical of Claire's career choice, now proudly told neighbors about their daughter who was changing how businesses viewed communication. The project launch event filled the main auditorium to capacity. Disability advocates, business leaders, community organizations all gathered. When Claire stepped onto the stage, her hands moved with the confident fluency of someone who had found her voice. 6 months ago, she began, reaching both hearing and deaf audience members through layered interpretation. I was invisible, not because I chose to be, but because I believed that was my place. I thought kindness was something you did quietly, in corners, without disturbing the important business of the world. From the front row, Jonathan watched her with a quiet smile. For the first time since losing his daughter, his memories brought warmth instead of only pain, a reminder that love and loss can coexist, and that healing is possible even after betrayal. Claire's voice grew stronger. But I've learned something. Kindness isn't meant to be invisible. It's meant to be a beacon, a bridge, a bold declaration that everyone, absolutely everyone, deserves to be understood, valued, and included. In the audience, Daniel nodded. His presence was a reminder of how far they had all come since that uncertain morning when a shy intern chose courage over comfort. As the applause thundered, Claire caught sight of a banner at the back of the room. Kindness always comes full circle. Daniel's words from that first day, now the motto of the initiative. After the crowd dispersed, Jonathan found Claire backstage, his face gentler than she had ever seen. She would have loved what you've built here, he said, speaking of his daughter. Every bridge you've created, every barrier you've removed, every person you've helped feel seen, she's been part of that. Claire felt the weight and privilege of carrying such a legacy. She wasn't just holding a position, she was holding a trust, a promise that no one would ever again feel as invisible as she once had. The girl who had once hidden in bathroom stalls now stood as proof that kindness, when joined with courage and competence, could transform not only individuals, but entire systems. One conversation, one connection, one act of recognition at a time. Kindness always comes full circle. And your circle might be exactly what someone is waiting for.